The Queen's Bishop Attack, Side 1. Hello, this is Michael Basman speaking. Mike Stean, who wrote the script, is currently playing in a tournament in South Africa, so I've agreed to do the reading for him. So let's begin. The trouble with playing a fairly standard opening repertoire with white is that you have to know so much. For instance, if you open 1 pawn to king 4, you immediately have to be prepared to meet pawn to king 4 back, or the Sicilian, French, Caro-Kann, not to mention a few uncommon moves like knight to qb3 or pawn to queen's knight 3. Your opponent knows and sticks to 1 or 2 systems with black, but you have to know how to meet everything with white. Quite a job, especially when you consider that new moves are being found here and there almost daily. So why not try something different, which you know and your opponent doesn't? On this cassette, I want to give you a very sound, interesting, and virtually self-contained system to play as white. It features an unusual move, at move 2 no less. 1, pawn to queen 4, black knight to kb3, and white bishop to knight 5. Please set this position up on your board. This way, you can bypass the enormous bulk of theory contained in the Nimzo, Queen's Indian, King's Indian, Grunfeld, and various Bononis, not to mention the Benko gambit. The basic idea behind this system is to take the knight, giving black doubled pawns, and slowly to exploit them. If this sounds a bit dreary, just look at some of the games that have been played. Before we actually get bogged down in any analysis, there are some general points worth making. Firstly, when playing against the doubled pawns, white's best central setup is very often with pawns on queen's bishop 3, queen 4, and king 3. The reason for this is that you have given up the bishop pair and need a strong and effective barrier against your opponent's black squared bishop. You'll also find that your pieces fit in very well with this formation. Secondly, although there are many attractive sacrificial lines for white, don't in general try for too much too quickly. Black's problems often stem from the fact that there are no points to counterattack in the white position, so try not to create anything for him. Thirdly, there's plenty of scope for originality. This opening can lead to complex play, but it is very little analyzed. The 2 Czech Grandmasters, Hort and Jansa, use it from time to time, as does the young Armenian Vahanian. But there are plenty of good ideas still to be found. You may well find some yourself. Now let's get down to some moves. On side 1, I will deal with the quiet developing continuations for black, which let white get on with the job. They are pawn to king's knight 3, pawn to queen 4, and pawn to king 3. Side 2 deals with the sharp moves, pawn to bishop 4, and knight to king 5, which attempt to cut across white's plans and lead to fascinating positions. We shall first of all consider 2 black pawn to king's knight 3. Please make that move. This is a move which a King's Indian or a Grunfeld player might make automatically, but it's not a particularly good one. White replies, bishop takes knight, black pawn takes bishop, and now white pawn to king 3, all according to plan. Now black has problems of finding a good plan. It isn't easy. In the game Vahanian Botterill from Hastings 1974, black played bishop to knight 2. And now please switch off the cassette and consider your next move for white. Have you studied the position? By the way, I recommend that you use these switch-off times to the full, for they are a chance to build up experience of the sort of positions that arise. Now, after black's bishop to knight 2, white played knight to king 2 here, not to bishop 3. He wants to bring the knight to the excellent square on kb4. In reply to this move, black played pawn to queen's knight 3 to fianchetto his other bishop. White went knight to bishop 4, and now black put a pawn in the center, pawn to queen 4. Had black gone bishop to knight 2, white would play pawn to bishop 4 and then knight to qb3 with a big spatial advantage. Now switch off again and study the position. White now probed with pawn to king's rook 4, a typical thrust in these positions. Black stopped him with pawn to king's rook 4. And now Vahanian decided that his position was good enough to open up with pawn to qb4. Black, lacking control of queen 4, played pawn takes pawn. White bishop takes pawn. Black bishop to knight 2. And white knight to queen's bishop 3. Black's position is already rather difficult. He can't castle, as that leaves his king's knight pawn hanging. So he tried to eliminate the powerful knight on king's bishop 4 by playing black bishop to king's rook 3. Now it's time to switch off again. White's next move was a shattering bishop takes pawn check. Black king takes bishop. And now white queen to knight 3 check. Note how well the queen and the king's knight combine together to control the central diagonal leading to the king's bishop 2 square. Black's king can only go back to king 1, as knight 2 and bishop 1 would allow knight to king 6 check, forking king and queen. So he played king to king 1. How would you now continue for white? White played the simple knight takes knight's pawn, which threatens the rook and also queen to king 6 check. So black parted with it, with queen to queen 2. White knight takes rook, and black queen to knight 2. The knight is now cornered, but white isn't worried. He carries on queen to king 6 check. King to bishop 1. And now knight to queen 5. Another piece comes crashing in. If black plays bishop takes knight here, then queen takes bishop, and white is utilizing the power of the mighty queen to its fullest advantage. She points in two directions, mate on queen 8 and the rook on rook 8. Now let's go back to the game. We'll have the white queen back on king 6 and the white knight on queen 5, and there should be a black bishop on queen's knight 2. Now The knight on rook 8 is untouchable at the moment because white would just check on king 7 and then play knight takes bishop pawn check, and that would win. So black developed with knight to queen 2. And now came a quaint little finish. Can you spot it? White moved knight to king 7. Now, if either knight is captured, knight to knight 6 wins the queen, and knight to knight 6 check can't be stopped anyway, so black resigned. Well, that was a nice 17-move victory to begin with, so we'll now have a look at another typical black approach. Please return to diagram A1. That's after white's played bishop takes knight and pawn to king 3. And we'll look at the game Jansa versus Pribble. Now, have you got the position? In answer to white's pawn to king 3, black chose a different plan, aimed at settling a knight on king 5. He played black pawn to kb4. White bishop to queen 3, and black pawn to queen 4. And now switch off again and study the position. White played queen to bishop 3 here. A rather unusual spot for the queen, but quite popular in this line. Note that it is not so easy to harass the queen by the black minor pieces, by such moves as black bishop to king's knight 5. Now after white queen to bishop 3, black played pawn to qb3, propping up the center, and white moved knight to king 2. This is a very typical piece setup for white. He's kept the option of a quiet build-up with knight to queen 2 and pawn to bishop 3, or an aggressive one with pawn to bishop 4 and queen's knight to bishop 3. Black now brought his knight to queen 2. He's headed for king 5, so switch off again and see how you would handle the position. There's quite a battle going on in the center. White played here pawn to bishop 4, and now things become a bit clearer. Black isn't going to get his knight to king 5. Let's say he goes, after white's pawn to bishop 4, knight to bishop 3, white queen's knight to bishop 3, and black knight to king 5. Then white goes pawn takes pawn, and black pawn takes pawn. In this position, black seems to have a very well supported knight, but white could simply castle kingside. The point is that if black goes knight to queen 7, forking the queen and the rook, white could then play bishop to knight 5 check, black bishop to queen 2, and then white queen takes queen's pawn. Now if black goes knight takes rook, queen to king 5 check, that seems to win a lot of material. So black's game has collapsed because he can't maintain his hold on queen 4. So let's return to diagram A2. After white has played pawn to bishop 4, I think black may have tried queen to knight 3 here, but instead he chose pawn takes pawn. White bishop takes queen's bishop's pawn, and now knight to knight 3. That's a more modest but nonetheless a useful spot for the knight. the white bishop retreats to knight 3, and black plays pawn to queen's rook 4, a small expansion on the queen side. It doesn't cost him any time anyway. So white played pawn to queen's rook 3 to keep his bishop on the diagonal. Black pawn to rook 5, white bishop to rook 2. Now black bishop to knight 2, and white's knight to qb3. That's the queen's knight. Both sides have developed normally, and now I suggest you switch off and study the position once more. Black wishes to exchange off white's powerful bishop, which has a beautiful diagonal leading to king's bishop 7. So he moves queen to king 2, which also has the virtue of stopping white knight to bishop 4, which would then be answered by black bishop takes pawn because of the pin on the king file. Now after black's queen to king 2, white continued with the characteristic pawn thrust, pawn to rook 4, king's rook 4, pawn to king's rook 4. And now black did exchange with bishop to king 3. And white had to play bishop takes bishop. Here it seems black might have gone queen takes bishop. And then if white knight to bishop 4, black could either go queen to bishop 5 or queen to knight 6, settling on the white squares. Now if this line is okay, then perhaps somewhere there was a fault in white's earlier play. Perhaps his fifth move, bishop to queen 3, was superfluous, and he might have immediately brought his king's knight round to king 2 and then to kb4, at the same time reserving most of his options. Now let's return to the game. White has just played bishop takes bishop, and black recaptured with the pawn, not the queen. So white's knight should be back on king 2, black queen on king 7, that's his king 2, and the black pawn on king 3. Now this recapture undoubles his pawns, but at the same time white now pushed on with pawn to rook 5. And now black became aggressive, pawn to king 4. Pay. White played here pawn takes king's pawn, and black bishop takes pawn. Now, as we've got a new situation on the chessboard, I suggest you have a look at it by switching off for a little while. White's next move may have come as a surprise to black. He castled queenside into the fire of black's bishop, knight and queen. But the move may have worse consequences for black's king, which is now trapped in the center. Black played knight to bishop 5 here, and he has the idea of playing knight takes rook's pawn, and then after pawn takes knight, queen takes pawn check. So how would you play as white in this position? I think white's got at least two good lines here. He could play pawn to king's knight 4, white pawn to king's knight 4, and if black plays knight takes rook's pawn, white can just ignore it and demolish all the pawns on the king side. If black doesn't play knight takes rook's pawn, he might play instead bishop takes knight, white knight takes bishop, and black knight to king 4, which at first sight appears to win a pawn. But then white could simply move queen to bishop 4, and if then black pawn takes knight's pawn, white plays pawn takes knight's pawn. And I think if you study the position a little, you'll see that black's position is very dubious. Now, let's return to diagram A3. The move white chose was even sharper. He played white knight to queen 4, which threatens knight takes queen's bishop pawn. And this would also be the reply if black castled here. Now black tried to combine defense with counterattack by playing rook to rook 3. Rook to rook 3, that threatens rook to knight 3. But he was rocked back by white's next sequence of moves. Switch off and see if you can find them. White played pawn takes pawn, black pawn takes pawn, and now white knight takes king's bishop pawn, not the queen's bishop pawn this time. And it was shortly all over, because if black plays pawn takes knight, then rook takes rook check, bishop takes rook, and queen to rook 5 check. If you look again at diagram A1 in the booklet, I think black's best line here is probably the modest bishop to knight 2, then white plays knight to king 2, then if black pawn to kb4, white knight to bishop 4, and now pawn to queen 3 for black, not pawn to queen 4. That doesn't give white a target on queen 5 to attack, though I feel that after pawn to king's rook 4, white would still keep the edge. If black allows pawn to rook 5 and meets it with pawn to king's knight 4, his front king's bishop pawn can become very weak. Not to mention the fact that pawn to rook 6 is almost always a good reply to black pawn to king's knight 4. On the other hand, if black stops the advance with pawn to king's rook 4, his kingside pawns become very static and full of holes. So let's leave pawn to king's knight 3, and that means return your pieces to the position after white's 2 bishop to knight 5. We'll look at the second of black replies, which is pawn to queen 4. This is a sensible, though unpretentious move, which again permits the doubling of his pawns. White plays bishop takes knight, and black has a choice of recaptures. Let's first look at king's pawn takes bishop. This is the most obvious reply, as it helps black's development. After black king pawn takes bishop, white continues pawn to king 3. It's now wrong for black to attack the center with pawn to qb4, as this will leave him with a weak queen pawn in the long run. It's sounder for him to prop up the center with pawn to qb3. Then white's best plan is to develop as flexibly as possible, keeping his opponent wondering whether he wants to attack on the king side, the queen side, or in the center. At Hastings a couple of years back, Hort sprung this line on me. I can tell you it wasn't a pleasant experience to be on the receiving end. Anyway, we reached the position after white's pawn to king 3, and I had a long think and tried black bishop to queen 3. White bishop to queen 3. Black knight to bishop 3. White pawn to qb3. And now black knight to king 2. My idea was not to castle too early, for fear of walking into a kingside attack, by, for example, white queen to bishop 3, then pawn to king's knight 4, and pawn to king's rook 4. I wanted first to exchange off the white squared bishops with black bishop to kb4. That's why I put the knight on king 2. One of my ideas was that against the normal development plans like queen to bishop 3, white queen to bishop 3, black bishop to king 3, white knight to king 2, I'd have black queen to queen 2. And that gains a tempo because there's the threat of bishop to king's knight 5, which will win the white queen. Hort, however, that's from the position in diagram A4. You better go back and reset the pieces. Hort simply played knight to queen 2, refusing to commit himself. I now realize that my intended bishop to kb4 would have lost a pawn. White just goes bishop takes bishop, black knight takes bishop, and now queen to knight 3, white queen to knight 3, hitting the queen pawn and the knight pawn. After black castles king's side, which pawn would you capture for white? Switch off here. White queen takes knight's pawn's best here, because queen takes queen's pawn would lose to black knight takes king's pawn, white pawn takes knight, and then white goes bishop to knight 6 check, and he'd pick up the queen. So after white's queen takes knight's pawn instead of queen takes queen's pawn, black can get a bit of play with rook to knight 1. Then if white queen takes rook's pawn, black rook takes knight's pawn. But I wasn't sure if this counterplay was enough. You might like to consider this position yourself to decide whether you think black has got some counter for his pawn. Otherwise, let's return to diagram A4, and after you've got the position, add the move white knight to queen 2. Now, instead of bishop to kb4, giving up the pawn, I played more slowly with pawn to bishop 3, white queen to bishop 2, stopping the exchange, black bishop to king 3, white knight to king 2, and black queen to queen 2. Hort now tried to expand on the queen side by playing pawn to queen's knight 4. But I got enough counterplay by replying pawn to queen's rook 4, and the game was eventually drawn. Instead of pawn to queen's knight 4, I think it was better to play white pawn to king 4, and then white would have a slight edge in the center. In general, I think that after 2 black pawn to queen 4, 3 white bishop takes knight, king's pawn takes bishop, white pawn to king 3. White has good prospects as his position is far more flexible than black. In particular, he has several good developing moves such as bishop to queen 3, knight to queen 2, which can be played before committing himself to a plan. However, what about the other recapture after bishop takes knight? Please return your pieces to the position after 2 white bishop to knight 5. Play black's pawn to queen 4. And then white bishop takes knight. Here black can go knight's pawn takes bishop. Although this is very rarely played, I think it's a far stronger move than king's pawn takes bishop, as it gives black more central control. It's especially important that he can play actively with pawn to qb4, which doesn't necessarily saddle him with a weak queen's pawn, because it can be propped up by the king's pawn later on. Practical examples with knight's pawn takes bishop are very scarce. I know of only 2. Both continued with white pawn to king 3, black pawn to qb4, hitting the center, and now white, rather than take the role of the second player with pawn to qb3, came out with pawn to qb4. Now this is a very complex position, so I suggest you switch off and study it. In a game Quinteros versus Rodriguez, Torremolinos 1975, black played pawn takes bishop's pawn, white bishop takes pawn, black pawn takes pawn, white pawn takes pawn, black bishop to knight 2, white knight to king 2, black knight to bishop 3, and white's queen's knight went to bishop 3. White won this game rather quickly. You can find its continuation in the accompanying leaflet and draw your own conclusions from it. Now let's return to the position in diagram A5. The second game I know of, Hort versus Tatai, Venice 1971, took a sharper turn. Black went pawn takes queen's pawn. White king's pawn takes pawn. And now switch off and consider the position from black's point of view. Black chose here queen to knight 3, intending to answer white's queen to queen 2 with bishop to rook 3, and then the queen's knight pawn would be hanging if white took the bishop. So instead of queen to queen 2, Hort tried knight to queen's bishop 3. He's hoping for black pawn takes pawn, white bishop takes pawn, black queen takes knight's pawn, and now white king's knight to king 2. And white has good play for the pawn. But if, instead of playing black pawn takes pawn, let's replace the pieces if you move them. Black queen should be on knight 3, and pawn on queen 4. White should have knight on knight 1, a bishop on kb1, pawns on qb4 and queen's knight 2. Black didn't play pawn takes pawn, he played queen takes knight's pawn straight away. White moved knight takes pawn, threatening the check on bishop 7, and now it's your move again for black. Black's next trick was bishop to bishop 4. And now it's far too dangerous for white to take the rook with knight to bishop 7 check, because black would later answer with queen to bishop 6 check, and the white king would have to be dislodged. So instead of checking, white decided to exchange the queens to be safe. He played queen to bishop 1. Black queen takes queen check. White rook takes queen, and black knight to rook 3, and black had quite a good position. It may be that white's best chance for an opening advantage lies in queen takes pawn in reply to pawn takes queen's pawn from the diagram A5. You may like to reset that position. Now if black plays after that pawn takes pawn, white can reach a slightly better endgame with queen takes queen check, and king takes queen, and bishop takes pawn. Now again from diagram A5, after white's queen takes pawn, black may try to sacrifice. He doesn't play pawn takes pawn himself, he plays knight to qb3, hitting the white queen. White plays queen takes queen's pawn. Black queen takes queen. White pawn takes queen. And black knight to knight 5. That threatens the queen's pawn and knight to bishop 7 check. But now white can go knight to queen's rook 3. Black knight takes queen's pawn. White bishop to knight 5 check. Black bishop to queen 2. White rook to queen 1. Here, if black plays pawn to king 3, then he's going to lose a piece to bishop takes bishop check and pawn to king 4. So that ends the analysis of black's second move, pawn to queen 4, and now we'll go on to the third continuation of the quiet lines. So replace your pieces to the position after white's bishop knight 5 on move 2. If you've got the position, we'll look at black's move to pawn to king 3. Please switch off and study this position for a little while. This move avoids the doubled pawns, but it does allow white to build up a pawn center with pawn to king 4. Then black plays pawn to king's rook 3. Clearly, if the bishop now retreats to rook 4, black will play pawn to king's knight 4 and take the king's pawn. So white still gives up his bishop by bishop takes knight. Black plays queen takes bishop. And now white knight to king's bishop 3. White has a nice centre and a slight lead in development, as the black queen is not very well placed. On the other hand, black has got the bishop pair and a solid position. Quite a delicate balance, but most over-the-board players would prefer white, I think. It was this line that brought Korchnoi his first success over Karpov in their match, which later turned out to be the World Championship match. The game Korchnoi versus Karpov carried on. Black pawn to queen 3. White knight to queen's bishop 3 now. Black moved another pawn, pawn to king's knight 3. And white went queen to queen 2. Now black dropped his queen back, queen to king 2. White castled queenside, and black pawn to queen's rook 3. Black's pawn moves look rather baffling, but stereotyped developing moves won't solve his problems of lack of space. White's next try was pawn to king's rook 4, black bishop to knight 2, and now switch off and consider the position again. Here white played pawn to king's knight 3. The idea is that if he develops his bishop on a natural square like queen 3, or even queen's bishop 4, it will be driven away and become a target for the black pawn advance on the queen side, and black wants to advance there to attack the white king. So Korchnoi developed it sideways onto king's rook 3 instead. That's why he played pawn to king's knight 3. After pawn to king's knight 3, black played pawn to queen's knight 4, white bishop to rook 3, and white stood a little better. That's the end of side 1. Queen's bishop attack, side 2. And now for something completely different. So far we've only considered simple moves for black, which tend to lead to a tense but rather slow positional struggle, in which white tries to cash in on the long-term weakness of his opponent's doubled pawns. From the point of view of playing the opening, the ideas are more important than the actual moves themselves. There aren't many tactical tricks hanging about. We're now going to change all that. Black has two sharp moves at his disposal: black knight to king 5 and black pawn to qb4, which lead to very tricky play and to some highly original and fascinating positions. Sacrifices of the queen's knight pawn abound, and there are some very nice tactical points to be made. The two variations, black knight to king 5 and pawn to qb4, are not entirely divorced, so there are several transpositional possibilities between the two. I shall point them out as we go along. If you have the position after two white bishop to knight 5 set up on the board before you, we'll look at black's move pawn to qb4. This is a logical plan, in that since white has sent his bishop over to the king side, black wants to cause trouble with his queen on the queen side. Please switch off and absorb the position a while. White has two tries for the advantage here. Other moves give him nothing. White can go bishop takes knight or pawn to queen 5. I believe bishop takes knight to be the more dangerous of the two. Black should recapture with the knight's pawn. For after bishop takes knight, if he plays king's pawn takes bishop, then white can simply go pawn to qb3 with a good position. For example, black plays queen to knight 3, white queen to knight 3, black queen takes queen, white pawn takes queen, black pawn takes pawn, white pawn takes pawn, black knight to bishop 3, white pawn to king 3. White's more solid pawn structure gives him a slight endgame advantage. Doubled queen's knight pawns don't matter. What does matter is black's isolated queen's pawn. Returning to 3 black knight's pawn takes bishop, that's diagram B1. White plays pawn to queen 5. Given time to develop, white will have a superb position. So the only move to worry him is black queen to knight 3. White can now sacrifice the knight pawn if he wants to, by knight to queen 2, which gives him good chances as black's position is dangerously undeveloped and difficult to coordinate. The British champion Bill Hartston took the knight pawn against Hort at Hastings a few years back, but had to withstand a lot of pressure before he secured a draw. You'll find that game in the supplementary leaflet. Now a simpler answer to black's queen to knight 3 is white's queen to bishop 1, defending the knight's pawn. And this could be, well, much more worrying for black, because for tactical reasons black can't easily liquidate the white pawn on queen 5. The game might go black pawn to bishop 4, white pawn to king 3, black bishop to knight 2, white pawn to qb3, and now black undermines with pawn to king 3. How would you now continue for white? Switch off here. White has the surprising move knight to king's rook 3. As black pawn takes pawn is met by knight to bishop 4. Now let's just run through the variations here to prove that white gets his pawn back. If black blows pawn to queen 5, white can play bishop's pawn takes pawn, and black can't recapture because his bishop on qb1 is hanging. Now if he plays instead of pawn to queen 5, queen to queen's bishop 3 to guard the queen's pawn, then white can just go bishop to king 2 and then bishop to bishop 3. Then again, if black goes queen to queen 3 rather than queen to queen's bishop 3, white comes out on the other side with knight to queen's rook 3. And that threatens knight 5 and then knight takes queen's pawn, because black won't be able to capture either of the knights because of the fork on bishop 7. So black's got to go after white's knight to queen's rook 3. Black has to play pawn to queen's rook 3. Now white will play queen to bishop 2, and he'll follow up by castling queenside, and black's position looks very sorry. Well, I hope that convinces you that white can get his pawn back, and if so, let's return to the main line, and that's diagram B2. After white's knight to king's rook 3 in the game Gurgenids versus Kappengut, black continued with pawn to king's rook 4. He wants to answer white's knight to bishop 4 by pawn to king 4, and then white won't be able to go around to rook 5, hitting his bishop. So after black's pawn to king's rook 4, white played bishop to king 2. And then black did play pawn to king 4, keeping the white knight out of bishop 4. White moved pawn to king's bishop 4. Black pawn to king 5. Now white brought his other knight to queen's rook 3. Now please switch off and consider this position. The conclusion of this game was quite brilliant, so let's see it. Black moved his queen to king's knight 3, and that attacks the king's knight pawn. White played knight to queen's knight 5, threatening a check on queen's bishop 7, so black parried that with knight to rook 3. And now white drove a wedge into the black position by playing pawn to queen 6. There's no need to defend the king's knight pawn, actually, because if black takes it, white will go rook to knight 1, and he can pick up the bishop on black's king's knight 2. So after white's pawn to queen 6, black played bishop to bishop 1, getting his bishop off the knight file and also trying to win the queen's pawn. What would be your move here? Switch off. White played queen to queen 2, first of a brilliant series. Black queen takes knight's pawn, and what does white do now? Switch off here. The next blow was queen to queen 5, sacrificing 2 rooks if black takes them. Let's see what happens if black does. Queen takes rook check for black, white king to queen 2, black queen takes rook. Now it's white's go. Queen to king 5 check, black king to queen 1, and white queen takes rook. Now it's black's turn again. Black queen takes pawn check, white king to king 1, and now black has to go king to king 1 himself, otherwise queen takes bishop check is going to be mate. So black king to king 1, and white starts off again. White queen to king 5 check, black king to queen 1, white queen to bishop 6 check, and black king to king 1. Now what's white's last and winning move? White should play bishop to bishop 4, and after black runs out of checks, which he will fairly soon, he's going to be mated on king's bishop 2. Now if you finish checking the white king, we'll return to diagram B3. and add the moves queen, black queen takes knight's pawn and white queen to queen 5 in that position. So after black played queen takes knight's pawn and white moved queen to queen 5, black didn't take the rooks, he played pawn to bishop 3, stopping the check on king 5. However, white simply played queen takes bishop's pawn. And now black decided he'd have to take the rooks. Queen takes rook check, king to queen 2, queen takes the other rook. This lost as well. Can you see the winning line? Let's play it out. Queen to knight 6 check, king to queen 1, queen takes pawn check, black king to king 1. And now queen to king 5 check. Black goes out to bishop 2, bishop to bishop 4 check, king to knight 3, queen to knight 5 check, king to rook 2, queen to bishop 5 check, king to knight 2. Now queen to bishop 7 check, and it's mate in a couple of moves. In retrospect, one might say that black could improve his play by playing pawn to king 4 in one move rather than 2 earlier on. But the conclusion remains the same. If black can't undermine white's pawn on queen 5, white has got good prospects. Now, please return to the position after white's second move, bishop to knight 5. Switch off to reset the pieces if necessary. Black plays pawn to bishop 4. And now we'll look at white's other possibility instead of bishop takes knight, and that's pawn to queen 5 immediately, which has been seen more often recently, mainly because of the following gambit, which I call, for obvious reasons, the Vahanian gambit. It gives white a tremendous attack. After white's pawn to queen 5, black goes queen to knight 3. And white sacrifices his queen's knight pawn with knight to queen's bishop 3. Black innocently captures with queen takes knight's pawn. Perhaps you would switch off here and look at the position. White retreats bishop to queen 2, a move pioneered by Vahanian, who won 2 brilliant games with it. We'll look at one of them against Kuprejcik here, and the other is given in the accompanying booklet. After bishop to queen 2, Kuprejcik brought his queen back to knight 3 to get it out of trouble. White advanced pawn to king 4, which threatens pawn to king 5. So black stopped with pawn to queen 3, pawn to queen 3. Now white pawn to bishop 4, expanding in the center. Please switch off and study this interesting position. Black tried to ignore white by playing pawn to king's knight 3. I expect his best move was pawn to king 3 here. So after pawn to king's knight 3, white pushed on, pawn to king 5. Black pawn takes pawn, white pawn takes pawn, and black's king's knight dropped back to queen 2. White moved knight to bishop 3, defending his king's pawn and developing a knight. White has really advanced his pawns far up the board, and it'll be interesting to see if he manages to keep his impetus going. So black played bishop to knight 2, trying to attack the king pawn again, and white moved rook to queen's knight 1. Black queen had to go back to queen 1. From this point onwards, try to find white's moves. Switch off and give yourself time to think. White's 12th move was pawn to king 6, an easy one to start off with. Black has to capture. Pawn takes pawn. Now it's your go again. White's next move was knight to king's knight 5. This is a typical thrust which often occurs when the black king 6 square has been weakened. For tactical reasons, if white had played pawn takes pawn instead of knight to knight 5, it wouldn't have been quite so good, because black could then have moved his knight to king 4, and when white checks on knight 5, black would be able to interpose with the knight on qb3. Now, back to the game. White's just played knight to king's knight 5, threatening to play knight takes king's pawn, which forks the queen and bishop. So black played knight to king's bishop 3, and now came the important check. White bishop to knight 5 check. Now black can't interpose with the knight. He can't play bishop to queen 2 either, because white would then play knight takes king's pawn. So black had no choice. He had to move the king to bishop 1. Black king to bishop 1. Now it's white's move again. He played pawn takes pawn, and this has the threat of knight to bishop 7, which is going to fork the black queen and the rook. Now we're approaching the crisis of the game, and black's trying to fight back now. He's played pawn to queen's rook 3, trying to dislodge white's bishop. So consider carefully your next move for white. Now if you played knight to bishop 7 here, you'd have let black back into the game with queen to queen 5. So white actually played not knight to bishop 7, but bishop to king 3. That leaves his bishop on knight 5 en prise, but the bishop can't be taken because of queen takes queen mate. And if black plays here queen takes queen check, white rook takes queen, black pawn takes bishop, white rook to queen 8 check. The knight can now go back to king 1, knight to king 1. Then white castles kingside with check. Black plays bishop to bishop 3. White can go simply rook takes bishop here, not the one on bishop 3, the one on bishop 8. Rook takes bishop. White's got his piece back, and he's still got a very strong attack. Now if you've satisfied yourself about this line, we'll go back to the actual game. Please go back to diagram B4 and add the move white bishop to king 3. Black played the move I was worried about, queen to rook 4, because he's threatening queen takes knight check. But white didn't worry at all. He played castles kingside. Now black can't take the knight because of queen to queen 8 and he gets mated. But can he take the bishop? Let's try pawn takes bishop. White rook takes pawn. Once again, black queen has to stay on the diagonal, so it goes back to bishop 2. Now switch off again and see how you would continue as white. It seems the best move here is knight to queen 5, not bishop to bishop 4. And wherever the black queen places itself, it's not entirely satisfactory, and white should win. You may like to work out those variations yourself, and after that we'll carry on with the game. So back to the game. That's diagram B4 with black playing queen to rook 4 and white having played bishop to king 3, and also white has castled. After white's castled, if black can't take the knight on qb3 and he can't take the bishop on knight 5, what can he do? Well, it's very hard for him, and even if he plays something like knight to queen's bishop 3, white could play bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and knight to king 4. Just a very strong position for white. So black tried to dislodge another white piece. In this position he played pawn to king's rook 3 to get rid of the knight on knight 5, but that was a disaster as well, because white then played queen to queen 3. This is sharp and decisive. If the knight is taken, queen takes knight's pawn, and black can't go bishop takes pawn because there's a mate on king 8. So after white's queen to queen 3, black played king to knight 1. White queen takes knight's pawn. Black bishop takes pawn. White knight takes bishop. Black rook to rook 2. I think the referee should have stopped the fight here, but Kuprejcik wobbled on. White moved rook takes knight, so if black plays pawn takes rook, queen to king 8 check is going to mate. Black moved knight to queen 2 and then called it a day. He's a bit too much material down, and he's going to lose his king soon as well. That was a brilliant game by Vahanian, which in my opinion places him in the same league as Tal and Bronstein. Returning from our carnival of sacrifices to the more serious question of theory, let's go back to the position after 2 white bishop to knight 5. Black plays pawn to qb4, and then white moves 3 pawn to queen 5. I think by now that we're convinced that queen to knight 3, white knight to qb3 is a good gambit. So is there a better move for black? Black can go knight to king 5, which leaves the bishop in a quagmire. It may want to retreat to rook 4, but that leads to a very dubious position. After white bishop to rook 4, black goes queen to knight 3. Now white has no good sacrifice of the knight pawn, and he's got to defend it with queen to bishop 1. Black goes here pawn to knight 4, and the pawn can't be taken because clearly white's queen's knight pawn will be hanging. And the other standard reaction, pawn to kb3, would run into pawn takes bishop, pawn takes knight, and then black bishop to rook 3. and the bishop can't be taken again because of queen takes knight's pawn by black. So after black's pawn to king's knight 4, white's got to have a bishop on rook 4, pawn on kb2, and a knight on king 5. White moves his bishop back to knight 3. Now it's your move again. Study the position a little. Black's sharpest continuation here is queen to king's rook 3, threatening to take the bishop on knight 3, after which white must recapture with the king's bishop pawn. This startling maneuver was discovered by Hort and completely refutes white's bishop to rook 4. If you've digested that short lesson, we'll return to the position on move 2 when white plays bishop to knight 5. Add black pawn to qb4, white pawn to queen 5, and again the spoiling attack, knight to king 5. What about the other retreat, bishop to bishop 4? Here too the reply black queen to knight 3 is still very annoying for white. He can't gambit his knight pawn effectively, and white's queen to bishop 1 is met by black pawn to king 3, liquidating in the center. White's best move after queen to knight 3 is probably bishop to bishop 1, but that's no way to go about getting an opening advantage. So we see that although 2 black pawn to qb4, 3 white pawn to queen 5 is very promising for white if black moves queen to knight 3 straight away, he is absolutely nothing after black knight to king 5, and that's why I recommend bishop takes knight for white on move 3 instead. We now come to the last major line on our tape, so return your pieces to the position after white bishop to knight 5 on move 2, and play black knight to king 5 straight away. Now please switch off and study this position a little. Black knight to king 5 is one of black's most interesting defenses, and as we go through you should bear in mind the transpositional possibilities into the 2 pawn to qb4 variation. Some of the differences are very subtle but very important. White clearly has the choice of 2 sensible retreats here, bishop to bishop 4 and bishop to rook 4. Each one has its pros and cons, but on the whole I suspect that bishop to bishop 4 is the better. I must admit that my preference is not based purely on analysis. To me it's highly significant that Hort and Jansa, 2 of the greatest experts with this opening, tend to play bishop to bishop 4 when confronted with black knight to king 5. The main disadvantage of bishop to bishop 4 is that it's less aggressive. The main point in its favour is that the bishop can still retreat along the diagonal queen's bishop 1 to king's knight 5 if necessary. We shall presently see why this is such a relevant factor. So, starting from the position after black's knight to king 5, white bishop to bishop 4, we'll look at 2 main variations, black pawn to qb4 or black pawn to queen 4. Other moves allow white to build a pawn center with pawn to kb3 and pawn to king 4, or to develop with a gain of time by pawn to king 3 and bishop to queen 3. First, black pawn to qb4. This should be met by white pawn to king's bishop 3, not pawn to queen 5, which would transpose into a dubious line of the 2 pawn to qb4 variation. So pawn to kb3, black's got to go back to king's bishop 3 with his knight, and now pawn to queen 5. Now if black tries his customary mucking up move, queen to knight 3, there comes knight to qb3, black queen takes knight's pawn, and then white bishop to queen 2. Do you get a feeling of deja vu? This is in fact the highly successful Vahanian gambit, with the white pawn on kb3 rather than kb2. As white is intending to follow up with pawn to king 4 and pawn to kb4, the difference is a mere formality, so the position can be regarded as essentially the same. Very promising for white. Had black not played his sortie with the queen, white could have continued with knight to queen's bishop 3 and pawn to king 4 to get a Benoni type of position with a move in hand. That can't be bad. So we see that pawn to qb4 on move 3 doesn't solve black's problems. Now back to the position after white bishop to knight 5 on move 2. Black plays knight to king 5 and white bishop to bishop 4. Here black can try pawn to queen 4. White pawn to kb3, black knight to kb3, and now white pawn to king 4. This is a black-mark gambit with an extra tempo. To accept the pawn is very dangerous for black. For example, black pawn takes pawn, white knight to queen's bishop 3, another piece comes out, and now if black takes the other pawn, white recaptures with the knight, and he's got a far too great lead in development. So instead of black pawn takes bishop pawn, black might go bishop to bishop 4 here, guarding his king's pawn. Now switch off and consider this position. A game of Jansa's once went pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, queen to bishop 3 here, but I think I've got an even better move than that. After black's bishop to bishop 4, white can go queen to king 2. That's a funny looking move, blocks the king's bishop, but it does clear the way for queenside castling, and there's also a check on knight 5, which would be annoying, can win the knight's pawn. So after queen to king 2, it looks like black can take the queen's pawn by queen takes queen's pawn. How would you then continue for white? Analyze the position for a little. After black queen takes queen's pawn, white's got queen to knight 5 check, which is very strong, but even better, knight to knight 5. Forks the queen and the bishop pawn. Black queen takes knight's pawn. White knight takes bishop pawn check. Black king to queen 1. And now white rook to queen 1 check. And white should come out rook ahead. Well, so much for the actual gambit with black accepting. Let's have a look and see what happens if black declines the offered pawn. Has white got anything then? Please return your pieces to diagram B5. Now in this position, after white's pawn to king 4, black could play the solid pawn to king 3. And white has no particularly dynamic follow-up. He can reach a French type of position with pawn to king 5, but then his bishop on king's bishop 4 is a bit awkwardly placed. Still, Hort's recommended follow-up with pawn to qb3 and bishop to king 3 may be good in that position. Jansa has his own very original way of treating these positions. He waits for black to play pawn to queen's bishop 4, and then takes the knight on queen's knight 8 with his bishop, and then he plays pawn to king 5. For example, one of his games went, after black played pawn to king 3, white knight to queen's bishop 3, black played bishop to knight 5, pinning the knight, white pawn to queen's rook 3, black bishop takes knight check, white pawn takes bishop, and now black stuck at the center with pawn to queen's bishop 4. Here Jansa put plan X into operation and played bishop takes knight, rook takes bishop, white pawn to king 5, and he followed it up with pawn to king's bishop 4, knight to bishop 3, and bishop to queen 3, which gave him a slight edge. We can see that in this position white's bishop harmonizes well with his pawn structure, whereas black's bishop is blocked in rather. So this highly ingenious idea of Jansa's of bishop takes knight and then pawn to king 5, from the theoretical point of view, may be the crucial test of white's bishop to bishop 4 on move 3. To wind things up, let's go back to move 2 and look at after white's bishop to knight 5, black knight to king 5. Now we'll look at white's other retreat with white bishop to rook 4. Now there is in fact some old theory on this move which runs black pawn to qb4, white pawn to kb3, and now black doesn't want to retreat his knight, he plays the adventurous pawn to king's knight 4. White pawn takes knight, and black pawn takes bishop. Now white supports his center with pawn to king 3. Now this is a very interesting and novel position. All the remaining pieces are on their original squares, and the pawns have gone wild. It rather looks as though a cat has just walked across the board. Without going into any detailed analysis, I just want to point out that this position, although by no means clear, is probably a bit better for white, as long as he can maintain his central pawns on the black squares to act as a barrier against the black king bishop. The white king is often well placed on king's bishop 2 to support the center. For instance, if black plays bishop to rook 3, white can go king to bishop 2, and then he threatens queen to rook 5. The reason for my not wanting to delve too deeply into this position is that I think there's a flaw in the analysis earlier on. If you'll have the position set up after white's bishop to knight 5 on move 2, and black played knight to king 5, hitting the bishop, white went back to rook 4, queen's bishop pawn to bishop 4, white pawn to kb3. Here black played the eccentric thrust with pawn to king's knight 4. But why can't he move his knight back to king's bishop 3? If white now takes the knight with bishop takes knight, black will recapture with the knight's pawn, and we transposed into the line with 2 pawn to qb4 and bishop takes knight, but with the unfavourable difference for white that he's got a pawn on king's bishop 3, and that leaves a nasty hole on his king 3 square, which can be exploited, say, by a black bishop coming out to rook 3, and perhaps later on to king 6. In short, the move white pawn to king's bishop 3 is never compatible with the exchange of white's queen's bishop. So, instead of taking the knight, white's only real hope for the advantage, after black retreats his knight to king's bishop 3, is to go pawn to queen 5 and not bishop takes knight. But here the disadvantage of bishop to rook 4 comes out. Black can move queen to knight 3, and now there's no good sacrifice of the queen's knight pawn, and we can't transpose into the Vahanian gambit, because the bishop can't go back to queen 2. And I find the sacrifice of the knight's pawn by pawn to king 4 for white, black queen takes knight pawn, white knight to queen 2, is rather unconvincing. Still, there may be something in it. Now, if white doesn't sacrifice his knight's pawn, let's have white's pawn back on king 2, black's queen on knight 3, and white's pawn on knight 2, knight on knight 1. So how is he to defend the knight pawn? If he goes queen to bishop 1, black will play knight takes queen's pawn. And if he goes pawn to queen's knight 3, then unfortunately black plays queen to knight 5 check, and that picks up a piece. It's this line that convinces me, and I hope you, and I think Hort and Jansa, that bishop to bishop 4 is a better move than bishop to rook 4. This concludes the analysis of bishop to knight 5 on move 2. It's a very nice, neat and self-contained system, leaving plenty of scope for the imagination. Before trying it out in practice, I recommend that you also play over the games in the supplementary booklet to acquire the feel for these rather unusual positions that tend to arise. After all, the greatest value of the opening is its surprise value, and you're trying to surprise your opponent, not yourself.